The water was freezing cold, the wind cut through like a blade, and the young merchant sailor gripped the rail of his sinking ship, watching everything around him disappear beneath the Atlantic. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for this. He was just a man trying to deliver food, fuel, and tanks to the Allies fighting in Europe. But somewhere out there in the dark, a German U-boat was already turning to find its next target. This happened thousands of times between 1940 and 1943. Ships vanished, cargo sank, men drowned in waters so cold they were dead in minutes. And every ship that went down meant fewer guns, fewer bullets, and fewer chances of survival for the men fighting on the beaches, in the deserts, and across the frozen plains of a world on fire. The Germans knew exactly what they were doing. Admiral Karl Dönitz had a plan. He called it the Tonnage War. The idea was brutally simple. If his submarines could sink Allied ships faster than the Allies could build new ones, the supply lines would collapse. Britain would starve, the Soviet Union would run out of ammunition, and the United States, no matter how powerful it became, would have no way to get its forces across the ocean in enough strength to matter. For a long time, it was working. In 1942, the year America entered the war in full force, German U-boats sank more than 8 million tons of Allied shipping. That is not a number, that is a catastrophe. 8 million tons meant thousands of lives. It meant entire convoys wiped out in a single night. It meant tankers burning on the horizon like floating volcanoes, while survivors clung to debris and shark-filled waters. Britain was running on borrowed time. The island nation could not feed itself. It could not manufacture enough weapons on its own. It needed a constant river of supplies flowing across the Atlantic, and that river was being poisoned at its source. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat threat. Not the Blitz, not Rommel in Africa, not even the fall of France. The submarines. Because without ships, there was no war to fight. Washington understood this. Roosevelt understood this. The military planners in the War Department understood this. But understanding a problem and solving it are two entirely different things. And in the spring of 1941, the United States was facing a shipbuilding crisis that seemed almost mathematically impossible to overcome. Here is what the numbers looked like at the start. A standard cargo ship of that era took approximately 230 days to build. That is nearly 8 months from the first steel plate to a functioning vessel sailing out of harbor. 8 months. And American shipyards, though skilled and experienced, were built around that pace. They had always worked that way. The workers knew that pace. The supply chains were designed for that pace. The entire culture of shipbuilding in America was rooted in the slow, careful crafting of massive steel vessels by small teams of expert welders, riveters, and engineers who had spent years learning their trade. The problem was that the war did not care about tradition. The war needed ships now. Franklin Roosevelt had already begun the process of trying to solve this in 1940, before the United States was even officially in the war. Under the Lend-Lease program, America had committed to supplying Britain with the materials it needed to survive. But material without transportation is useless. You could manufacture 1,000 tanks in Detroit, and they meant nothing if there was no ship to carry them across the ocean. The Maritime Commission, the federal agency responsible for American merchant shipping, was given an emergency order: build ships, build them fast, build them by the hundreds, and find a way to do it that had never been done before. They turned to a man named Henry Kaiser. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. That is the first thing you need to understand about him. He was a construction man. He had built roads in the Pacific Northwest. He had helped build the Hoover Dam and the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. He understood concrete and rock and massive infrastructure projects that most people considered impossible. But ships were precision engineering. Ships were the domain of specialists with lifetimes of training. When Kaiser first appeared in Washington and told the Maritime Commission he could help solve their shipbuilding problem, the naval architects in the room probably tried not to smile. This man had never built a ship in his life. He didn't know the terminology. He didn't know the established methods. He was, in the most polite sense, an outsider. But that was exactly what made him dangerous. Kaiser looked at a ship the same way he had looked at the Hoover Dam. He didn't see a vessel of the sea shaped by centuries of tradition. He saw a construction problem, a massive assembly challenge, a logistics puzzle that needed to be broken down into components, standardized, streamlined, and attacked with industrial force. The ship he was asked to build was called the Liberty Ship. It was a deliberately simple design, not elegant, not fast, not built for combat. It was a cargo vessel designed to do exactly one thing with maximum efficiency: carry supplies across an ocean. The design was based on an older British tramp steamer, chosen specifically because it was straightforward to manufacture. Flat surfaces instead of curves where possible, standard dimensions, bolt-on components that could be fabricated in factories hundreds of miles from the water and then shipped to the yards for final assembly. The concept of prefabrication was not entirely new, but no one had ever applied it to ship construction on the scale that Kaiser was imagining. He set up his first major yard in Richmond, California, then another, then another. He eventually operated yards on both coasts, each one a small industrial city unto itself, employing tens of thousands of workers around the clock in 3 rotating shifts. The yards never slept. They were lit up through the night like steel suns burning at the edge of the water. But the real revolution was not in the facilities, it was in the workforce. Kaiser had a radical idea. He didn't need experienced shipbuilders, he needed trainable human beings. Men and women who had never welded a piece of steel in their lives could be trained to do one specific task, a single weld, a single component, a single repetitive job, in a matter of weeks. You didn't need to understand the entire ship, you needed to understand your piece of it. And when thousands of people each understood their piece with absolute precision, the whole thing came together with astonishing speed. Women who had been working as waitresses and school teachers in 1940 were operating heavy machinery and running welding torches by 1942. African American workers, many of them migrants from the South seeking war work in the industrial North and West, joined the yards in massive numbers. Kaiser built childcare facilities on site so that mothers with young children could work full shifts. He built a medical program for his workers that was so advanced it eventually evolved into one of the earliest models for American employer-provided health care. He understood something that most industrialists of his era did not fully grasp. The most important machine in the shipyard was the human being standing next to it. And then he did something that genuinely shocked the traditional shipbuilding world. He changed the way metal was joined. For generations, ships had been built using rivets, thousands upon thousands of small metal fasteners driven through overlapping steel plates by teams of workers who had trained for years to do it correctly. Riveting was loud, hot, dangerous, and slow. It required a 4-person team working in coordination, and even experienced crews could only complete a certain number of rivets per day. Kaiser switched to welding. Not entirely and not overnight, but progressively, systematically, his yards replaced riveting with electric arc welding wherever structurally possible. Welding was faster, it created a stronger, smoother joint, and critically, it could be learned in weeks rather than years. The critics were loud. The old guard of naval engineering warned that welded ships were dangerously experimental. Some of the early Liberty ships did in fact develop cracks, particularly in cold water, where the steel became brittle. This was a genuine engineering problem that took time and material science research to solve. But Kaiser pressed forward, adjusting specifications, improving steel composition, and training his welders with greater precision. The problems were worked out, and the speed gains were extraordinary. By 1942, Kaiser's yards were building Liberty ships faster than anyone had thought possible. The original estimate of 230 days per vessel had already been slashed dramatically. Ships that took over a year to build before the war were rolling out of the Richmond yard in under 2 months. Then Kaiser decided to prove a point. In September 1942, he announced a public challenge. His crews would attempt to build a single Liberty ship from keel to completion in record time, not secretly, not quietly, in full view of the press, the public, and the enemy. The ship would be named the Robert E. Peary. The attempt began at midnight. Workers streamed into the yard in shifts, each person knowing exactly what they needed to do and where they needed to be. The steel plates arrived pre-cut and pre-shaped from fabrication facilities that had been running around the clock for weeks. Sections of the ship arrived from other buildings already partially assembled, waiting to be lifted into position by enormous cranes and welded into place. The noise was continuous, the light was blinding. Welding torches burned through the night across the entire hall. Electrical cables snaked across the yard like rivers. Supervisors moved through the chaos with clipboards and stopwatches, tracking every component, every connection, every minute. The ship was assembled, fitted, launched, and operational in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. 4 days. When the news reached Germany, the response was a mixture of disbelief and something harder to admit, fear. The German Naval Command had built their U-boat strategy around a simple mathematical equation. Their submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than the Allies could replace them. That equation was the foundation of their plan to strangle British and Soviet supply lines before American industrial power could be brought fully to bear. Kaiser had just broken the equation, because a ship built in 4 days could never be sunk fast enough. Even accounting for the devastating losses of the Battle of the Atlantic, even with hundreds of German submarines prowling the ocean in wolf packs, the American shipyards were now producing vessels at a rate that simply could not be matched by destruction. For every ship that went down, more were coming, many more, and each one carried tanks, ammunition, food, aircraft, fuel, spare parts, and the 1,000 other items without which modern armies cannot function. Between 1941 and 1945, American yards built 2,710 Liberty ships, 2,710 of them. At its peak, the American shipbuilding program was producing a new vessel every single day. The total tonnage launched by American yards during the war exceeded the combined output of every other nation on Earth. This was the turning point that many people never see in history books. The great battles get the attention, Midway, Normandy, Stalingrad, but underneath all of those battles was a logistical foundation that made them possible. That foundation was built in places like Richmond, California, by women and men who had never been near an ocean before 1942. Dönitz watched his strategy collapse in slow motion. His submarines were still sinking ships. The losses in the Atlantic remained horrifying throughout 1942 and into 1943, but the balance had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Every U-boat victory now meant less than it had before. The ships kept coming, the supplies kept flowing, the armies kept growing. And then the Allies solved the other half of the problem. New radar technology made it increasingly difficult for U-boats to operate on the surface at night, which had been their preferred hunting method. Long-range patrol aircraft began covering gaps in the Atlantic that had previously been impossible to reach from either shore. Escort carriers, small but effective, began accompanying convoys directly, providing air cover throughout the entire crossing. The Enigma intelligence breakthrough allowed Allied planners to route convoys away from wolfpack positions with increasing accuracy. The combination was lethal for the Germans. In May 1943, the month that historians call Black May in German naval records, Dönitz lost 41 submarines, not sunk in battle over months, 41 in a single month. The German submarine crews, who had once been celebrated as heroes in Berlin, were now dying faster than they could be replaced. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew by mid-1943 was measured in patrols, not years. Dönitz pulled his submarines back from the North Atlantic. He had no choice. The strategy that was supposed to win the war for Germany had been defeated not by a naval battle, but by a concrete contractor from California and the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans who showed up to his shipyards and learned to weld. This is the story that the war's great commanders understood, even if the public often did not. Eisenhower knew it. Marshall knew it. Churchill understood it viscerally, in the way that a man understands something when his survival depends on it. Wars in the modern age are not won only by soldiers. They are won by the civilization standing behind the soldiers, by the supply chains, by the factory floors, by the engineering decisions made in Washington conference rooms and California shipyards, by the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary work in service of something larger than themselves.
Henry Kaiser was never on a battlefield. He never wore a uniform. He never fired a weapon or gave a military order. But the ships he built carried the ammunition that armed the soldiers at Normandy. They carried the fuel that powered the tanks rolling across France. They carried the food that kept Allied armies fighting through the brutal winter campaigns in Italy and the Pacific. Without those ships, the war looks different, much different. The Liberty ship was not a beautiful vessel. Sailors who served on them sometimes called them ugly ducklings. They were slow. They rode rough in heavy seas. They were not designed for comfort or elegance. They were designed for one purpose, and they fulfilled that purpose with a kind of brutal efficiency that matched the brutal efficiency of the war itself. There is something almost poetic about that. The war stripped everything down to what mattered. Elegance didn't matter. Tradition didn't matter. What mattered was whether the tanks arrived, whether the bullets got there, whether the men on the other side of the ocean had what they needed to fight. Kaiser understood that before most people did. He stripped the problem down to its essentials and attacked it with everything he had, and he won. Not all the credit belongs to Kaiser alone. That would be too simple and too easy. The workers in his yards deserve the credit. The engineers who solved the welding cracks deserve the credit. The Maritime Commission officials who took the political risk of backing an outsider deserve the credit. The convoy commanders who kept their ships moving through the most dangerous waters on Earth deserve the credit. The merchant marines who climbed aboard those vessels, knowing the statistical likelihood of a submarine attack, deserve more credit than they have ever received. The merchant marine lost more men per capita during World War II than any branch of the American armed forces. They were not soldiers. They received no veterans' benefits after the war for decades. Many of them came home to no parades, no recognition, nothing but the memory of the men they had watched drown in the Atlantic. It took until 1988 for the United States government to formally recognize merchant mariners as war veterans. That debt has never fully been paid. But the contribution they made, alongside the men and women in the shipyards, alongside the planners and engineers and welders and crane operators and supply chain managers who made the miracle of American industrial production real, that contribution changed the world. Think about what it means that a civilian with no shipbuilding experience looked at a 230-day problem and turned it into a 4-day achievement. Think about what that says about human ingenuity under pressure, about the difference between a system built around tradition and a system rebuilt from scratch around necessity. There are moments in history when the old ways have to give way, when experience becomes a limitation rather than an asset, when the person who doesn't know what's impossible is exactly the right person for the job. Kaiser didn't know you couldn't build a ship in 4 days. Nobody had bothered to tell him, and so he went ahead and built it. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, for all the engineering genius that produced their submarines, for all the strategic vision of men like Dönitz and Rommel and their colleagues, could not match what America was doing on the factory floor. They could sink ships. They could not sink a shipyard. They could destroy cargo. They could not destroy the American capacity to replace it. That asymmetry was the war. Everything else was detail. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because we live in a world still shaped by what happened in those years. The post-war order, the alliances, the institutions, the prosperity that defined the second half of the 20th century, all of it rests on a foundation built in the early 1940s by people who had every reason to believe the task was impossible. They chose not to believe it. The next time you hear that something can't be done, that the old way is the only way, that the numbers don't add up and the timeline is impossible and the resources aren't there, remember what happened on a shipyard in Richmond, California in September 1942. 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. A ship in 4 days. What do you think the world would look like today if those ships had never been built? Leave your answer in the comments, because the real history of this war is still being understood, and it begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the places most people never think to look.